Welcome to Tanakh Talk. Broadcasting live out of Kingston, Texas with Rabbi Michael Skoback. Another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. And earlier today, I thought that's what we were doing. Oh my goodness gracious. I was just thinking, Rabbi, when I put stream, I actually clicked the stream first and record as usual. And I looked up and I had the wrong screen up and I was staring at me, and so I just gave a big old smile. It set the mood. I think I sniffed too many paint fumes this afternoon. I know that's got to be it, Rabbi.
I think you're having too much fun here on Tanakh Talk.
Yes. And you know what? That's a great thing in my opinion. I love having fun with you guys. And it really is a joy. It really, really is. I'm just over delighted to be able to participate with you and all these others. It's just as great. This is definitely a dream come true for me, for sure. So... thank you, Rabbi.
This is not your day of rest.
No, this is definitely work day one. So grateful for that too, actually. Indeed. Wow. So how was your afternoon? Did you get a little bit of lunch and some resting?
Yeah. I mean, I did a lot of stuff between now and the last time I spoke with you. It's like been a whole day's worth of activities.
Seems like it. All right. Well, today we're going to kick off with Acts chapter 15.
15.
Yes. And I'm serious. Earlier today, I was so thinking. Whenever you said, "What? That's not what we're doing," I was sitting here thinking, "Did we already do 15?" I wasn't even thinking about like what time of day it was. Oh, that was definitely a Twilight Zone moment for me. So, well, good. I'm glad we're doing 15. This is a very interesting, definitely an interesting chapter. I'll throw a few messianic spins in there for you along the way. That thing. Oh, it's on a loop cycle. What am I doing? I'm clicking all kinds of buttons. I didn't even realize it. Oh, yeah. This is good. This is good. It'll be a good episode for today. So, Rabbi, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll follow along as usual.
Well,
okay.
This chapter is famous for many reasons. In terms of the unfolding of the Jesus movement, in terms of how it is now really dealing with, actually in this chapter, the first dispute. Really, it's the first really major question that comes up in the early days of the movement. We're going to see the question is, because over the past few chapters, we saw that Paul was going on his missionary journeys throughout Asia Minor to a number of cities. Apparently, he's been successful in connecting with Gentiles, which never really happened in the Jesus movement. We know that in the Gospels, Gentiles are out of the picture. Mm-hmm. And even in the early chapters of Acts, there's not a lot going on with Gentiles. And Paul essentially declares himself to be the apostle to the Gentiles. At one point, we saw, I think, back in chapter 14 or 11. I think I'm getting confused now. He's frustrated with the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. He says, "Now look, I'm finished with you guys. I'm going to the Gentiles." And so now there's a question. The question is, what do we do with these Gentiles? What's going to happen with them? And so chapter 15 begins by telling us that there were people who came from Judea, apparently from Jerusalem, and they were coming really to the places where Paul was operating. So they left Israel. Now, it's interesting. Why is it that they left Israel, to come and tell Paul what he should be doing? Because what they were teaching these people coming from Jerusalem was that, look, Paul, your converts, your Gentile converts, if they really want to join our movement, our messianic movement following Jesus, they're going to have to get circumcised and follow all the commandments of the Torah. Now, that's basically code for convert to Judaism, meaning that the definition of conversion to Judaism is the need for a Gentile to accept upon themselves all the commandments of the Torah, including, of course, the most symbolic one would be for men, circumcision. And so the question is, why are these people coming? Why are they schlepping all the way out to wherever Paul is teaching now? And I think it's possible, again, I can't prove this, that they came to check up on Paul. I think that we're going to see, especially when we get to Paul's letters, Galatians, that there were people that were stalking him. There were people that were following him. There were people from Jerusalem that that were suspicious of him.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to see that the major conflict really was over the question of the Torah, the law, the commandments.
Now, chronologically speaking, which of Paul's letters were first, and which ones kind of ended up in the tail end?
Well, we know that First Thessalonians was the first letter.
Okay.
And now that's being written about the year 55 approximately. Now, Acts that we're reading now, we know was written by Luke, and the scholarly opinion is that this is being composed in about the 80s, 90s.
So it's at the tail end, right?
Well, I mean, Paul's letters were already done in the 60s. I mean, because he was himself killed. I don't think he lived, into the 70s at all. I think he was in sometime in that sixth decade of the first century. Paul died already, so Paul's already long gone. Interestingly enough, probably about 20 years at least.
Mm-hmm.
By the time this book of Acts is being written, which is it's sort of a little bit confusing because this is a history that's being written looking backwards at stories that already happened, and of course Paul's letters that really deal with the same topic are written much earlier, and that's why they're important. They're important for two reasons. Number one, because they were written more at the time that the stories took place, and number two, they're written by Paul himself. Now, this account that we're reading here in Acts is written not by Paul. It's written about Paul, right?
Mm-hmm.
By Luke, and it's written a long time after the stories happened. And so, if we're going to choose, which one is probably more accurate in terms of what was going on,
it would be the ones that he wrote.
Yeah, you would imagine. And so, here you have this, I think it must have been a group of people that were coming to Paul's ministry in the diaspora, because there were, as we're going to see later on in the book of Acts, there were rumors that were hounding Paul. People were hearing already back in Judea that there were issues with Paul. And again, the main issue is going to be over the question of the role of the Torah, the commandments, and there was a lot of suspicion about him.
I'd like to insert a thought on this Acts 15 verse, the verse 1, where it says, "Except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved." There is circumcision is in the Torah, obviously, but the circumcision after the manner of Moses is not in the Torah. It's in the oral Torah. That's where he describes how one must be circumcised after the manner of Moses. And so part of me thinks that this right here is just another pointer, really maybe even suggesting that Paul may have been, first Karaite, if you will, someone who really disregards the oral Torah altogether. And it's like, because it seemed like they was discussing two issues here, one being circumcised and the second one on how it was being circumcised. So
it's an interesting point you're making, to distinguish between circumcision and circumcision according to the custom of Moses. Because what's interesting is that, the classical Christian understanding of the oral law was that it wasn't from Moses, right? The classical understanding is that, anything taught by Moses is from God. That was the revelation of God. And, what the oral law was, again, according to the way most Christians understand it, are the traditions of the rabbis that are not coming from Moses. Now, that's not accurate from a Jewish point of view. From a Jewish point of view, the oral Torah is from Moses just as much as the written Torah is. So you're raising an interesting point, and whether you can distinguish between circumcision, which maybe Paul was accepting here for the Gentiles, and the only problem that he had was with the oral law way of doing it. I'm not reading it that way. I mean, but I think it's an interesting proposal. I think that what it means here is that, we know later on that these people are Pharisees who were the bearers of the oral Torah. So from their point of view, Moses taught the oral law as well. And what they're saying is that these Gentiles, and it becomes clearer if you just jump down for a minute to verse 5, where it says that some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed, right, they believed in Jesus as the Messiah, rose up saying it is necessary to circumcise them, right, and to command them to keep the Torah of Moses. So I think that what it's referring to here is simply the observance of the Torah, and to get circumcised. And since these are Pharisees, right, it would be keeping the Torah as understood by both the written and oral Torah,
right.
Exactly, to circumcise according, because you're right, in the written Torah itself, there aren't really any instructions about what even circumcision is.
Right.
If you just have the written text of the Torah, you wouldn't even know what part of the body circumcision is done.
You'd be missing an earlobe or a skin of the elbow.
Take off your little tip of your elbow.
Yeah.
It seems to me that what's going on is that Paul was not, requiring any circumcision from the Gentiles, and he wasn't requiring that people keep any of the laws of Moses. And these people are coming and they're saying, look, they're basically saying, look, these are non-Jews, and if they want to join our movement of people who are following the Messiah, they have to become Jews just like we do, and just like we are, and that's going to be happening through conversion, which would be through circumcision and the performance of all the commandments. So I think that what they're arguing for here is that the Gentiles that Paul is reaching out to, they have to be converted to Judaism, and that became a question. Is that necessary? Is that required for Gentiles coming into the movement? And so in verse 2, we're told that when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them, meaning it's saying that apparently that Paul and Barnabas argued with them. They didn't accept this idea that the Gentiles have to convert to Judaism. So these people who came from Judea determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. Now, it's interesting that it seems like what happened is these people from Jerusalem, and it seems they were Pharisees who were followers of Jesus, were insisting that the Gentiles become converted to Judaism and observe all the laws of the Torah. Paul and Barnabas were saying no. Now, we don't know what their position was. It just says that they disputed with them. And then it seems that what's happening is that this group that came from Jerusalem, they decided that, look, Paul and Barnabas, you're going to have to come back with us to Jerusalem. So it sounds like they're really being summoned to go back to Jerusalem. It doesn't sound like Paul himself is so interested in doing this. And we know why. We know this from later on, that Paul did not really see himself as answerable to the apostles in Jerusalem. He basically looked down upon them, and he felt that he had authority from Jesus directly to be the apostle to the Gentiles, and he didn't need to speak to anyone else. So we know that Paul was not really interested in going to Jerusalem.
So he was basically a self-appointed rabbi.
Well, I think that's what happened.
Yeah.
He claims that Jesus appointed him, but if we don't accept his claim that Jesus came and spoke to him, it would be he himself that, assumed this role. And what happens, interestingly, in the book of Galatians, and I'm not going to do too much comparison tonight because it would take us forever, but in the second chapter of Galatians, where Paul seems to tell this story on his own, he doesn't say that he was summoned or he was told by others that he has to go to Jerusalem. Paul in Galatians chapter 2 says that it was God who told him to go to Jerusalem. Probably what he means is that from his point of view, that it was Jesus who told him, and that means God told him. So we have a little bit of, not a little bit, we're going to see there's a massive discrepancies between Galatians chapter 2 and this chapter here in Acts. But I'm going to try to stick to Acts today, at least. So that's what happens. So Barnabas and Paul are essentially told, look, you got to come back with us to Jerusalem. And that's what they do. They are now going to get a ruling from the Jerusalem Council about what the deal is. I mean, what do we do with these Gentiles? It's not clear to me, by the way, just I want to go back for a minute. When these people came from Judea and said that unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. I'm not really clear exactly what it means to be saved. I mean, what are they referring to? It sounds like a borrowed phrase because, in normative Judaism, we don't talk about, being saved in some kind of spiritual way. I mean, the only way that word is really used in Scripture is that if you're being attacked by enemies, you're going to be rescued physically. Right. And it sounds here like they're using the word saved in the way that Paul will use it, which is that, you have a spiritual death sentence of eternal damnation that, you're going to suffer unless you come to faith in Jesus. So it sounds like that, they're using this expression, you cannot be saved, as, sort of eternal life and to have share in the world to come. So the word is a little bit odd. And what happens now, I guess the key thing to bear in mind, and I'll get back to this a few times, is that, well, I think I'll just point it out now. I think one of the reasons this chapter is important, is significant, one of the reasons is that I think it's really pretty strong evidence that the disciples of Jesus, the apostles, meaning the original followers of Jesus who are now based in Jerusalem, that they were Torah observant. That's the issue that I think we can safely walk away with from this chapter, and it's an important piece of information, meaning that we saw back in Acts chapter 5 with the whole trial of Peter and the others in front of Gamliel, that it seemed pretty clear from that story that Peter and the others were Torah observant. Otherwise, Gamliel would not have said, leave them alone, they're doing nothing wrong. It seemed from that story that the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem were Torah observant. And again, it shouldn't come as a surprise, because essentially everything out of Jesus' mouth was that they should be keeping the commandments. And so this chapter also is another, I believe, proof that the apostles and the Jesus movement that was based in Jerusalem were Torah observant, because if they weren't, there'd be no one suggesting that Gentiles coming into the movement would have to begin observing the commandments of the Torah. It wouldn't be a question, or it wouldn't even be a suggestion that we're going to require Gentiles to keep the Torah unless the Jews themselves were observing the Torah. So I think that it's very clear from this chapter, whatever decision they're going to come up with in terms of policy for Gentiles coming into the movement, it's very, very clear that what's not said, what the leaders of the movement don't say in this chapter, is that really no one has to keep the Torah. The only question about observing the Torah is for Gentiles, and it seems that the requirement of Torah observance for Jews is taken for granted. That's not even a question. So now in verse 6, they get together in Jerusalem. The apostles and the elders come together to consider this matter, because this was a bit of a controversy. And when there had been much dispute, I guess there was a lot of back and forth, Peter rose up and said to them, "Men and brethren, you know," we're in verse 7 now, "that a good while ago God chose among us that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe." It's interesting that, Peter here doesn't make any reference to the Great Commission. It sounds like, Peter is almost saying that this idea of going to the Gentiles was something that was sort of originated with him, and that he was given some kind of a private revelation. But again, they don't seem to be aware of the fact that in Matthew 28, Jesus had already given, allegedly. Now, I mentioned last week, I believe, that I don't personally believe Jesus gave this Great Commission.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is another proof for that Peter doesn't seem to have any knowledge of it and doesn't mention it. But Peter says that we were chosen. That God chose us among us, that through my mouth, Peter says, the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe.
I think
and he goes on and says, excuse me?
I think if Jesus did actually produce that Great Commission, that would have been even a much more resistance from the Jews to even accept it because of Jeremiah.
How is that?
Well, I mean, the prophecy that, I think it was in Jeremiah, says, that the new covenant was for the house of Israel and Judah, or however that's worded. And so if Jesus came preaching, it's not just for you guys, but now it's also for all of the nations also, that's just a direct violation of the prophets that they would have already known about.
Possibly. I mean, it's a good point you're making. I mean, you could, say that, Jeremiah, is the new covenant of putting the Torah into the hearts of Israel and Judah is limited to the people of Israel and Judah, but the ramifications of that, because we know that through the scriptures, there's going to be an impact, in the Messianic age on the Gentiles as well. So it's not as if the Gentiles don't have any role or significance in the Tanakh in terms of God's ultimate plans. So I'm not sure that Jeremiah 31 there would be a knockout punch. If Jesus did say that, look, we have a mandate to teach the Gentiles, because that's, again, part of the, God's, message to us is we're supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, a light into the nations.
Right.
But I agree with you that it could be argued, that point. But I'm just suggesting that this idea of a Great Commission probably comes up only later, and it didn't really come from Jesus.
Got it.
And Peter here sort of ignores that, and he goes on in verse 8 and says, "So God, who knows the heart, acknowledged them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us, and made no distinction between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. Now, therefore," Peter argues, "why do you test God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples," meaning the Gentile disciples, "which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? But we believe that through the grace of the Lord Jesus, we will be saved in the same manner as they." Now, this is a real mouthful, this speech by Peter. It seems pretty clear, at least to me, that if you take this speech in a certain way, at least in the way it seems to be understood on the simplest level, it seems to be totally out of character for Peter and totally out of character for the Jerusalem apostles. I mean, it seems to be something that Peter would never have said. It seems very, very out of character. And it really seems to be the kind of speech that was retrofit back into the mouth of Peter later on by the author of Acts. It's just a very, very strange speech that he's giving here, and I'll try to analyze it. First of all, to say that God made no distinction between the Gentiles and the Jews is just absurd. The scripture is very clear. If you go to a passage like Psalm chapter 147, it speaks very clearly at the very end, the last two verses, that there's a huge distinction between Israel, who was given the Torah to observe, and the Gentile nations who were not given the Torah to observe. And there are gazillion laws in the Bible that do distinguish between Jews and Gentiles. For example, the prohibition against intermarriage, about marrying Gentiles, etc. So to say that God didn't make any distinction between us and them is a bit of a problem. Because it's a very, very absolute statement that God made no distinction. I mean, if it would have said here he made some distinctions, that would be more tolerable. But to say that he didn't make any distinctions is problematic. And then he goes on to say that why would we require the Gentiles to observe the Torah? Because that would be putting a yoke on the neck of these Gentile disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear. Now, it seems that what he's saying is that it's impossible to keep the Torah.
Now, were the disciples Gentiles? I thought they were all Jewish.
Well, I think that he's using the word disciples here to refer to the Gentile disciples that they're arguing about.
Okay, got
it. Because that's the question. He's saying, why do you test God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples? Meaning that's what you guys who are arguing that the Gentiles should be circumcised and observing the commandments. That's what you're arguing, Peter says here. You're testing God by wanting to put a yoke on these disciples. Again, I'm assuming he's referring to the Gentile disciples that Paul is bringing in. Why do you want to make them do something, Peter here says, which neither our fathers nor we? So he's distinguishing between we, right, the Jewish followers of Jesus, and the other disciples, which are the Gentiles. And Peter is saying that it's impossible for us to keep the Torah, so why impose it on the Gentiles?
Right. Huh.
And the problem there, is again back to Deuteronomy chapter 30, where God weighs in on this question, and God says it's not too difficult to keep the Torah. So what do you mean? What is Peter saying here all of a sudden, that it's impossible to keep the Torah? Very, very problematic. And to basically say that now there's no distinction between Jews and Gentiles, and essentially seeming to say that we believe in verse 11, he says here, that through the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ will be saved in the same manner as they. Meaning that he seems to be saying that salvation will come through believing in Jesus and not through the observance of the Torah. Now, the problem is that this is pure 100% Pauline doctrine, meaning that the two things that Paul will be teaching in the letters, when we get to his letters, are that number one, the distinction between Jews and Gentiles has been broken down. Right? Paul says it's neither Greek nor Jew. We're all now one in the body of Christ. Or when Paul says that the middle wall of partition has been broken down between Jews and Gentiles. I mean, it's one of the major themes. Paul speaks about one new man. There's going to be one new man, not like, the old world order where there were differences between people. Paul has this idea that, with the coming of Jesus, the distinctions between Jews and Gentiles basically evaporate.
But he even goes into Romans, real fast into Romans, he even goes as far as to say, on the other end of the spectrum. I think this is why Paul is so hard to understand, is because he says one thing in Galatians and he says one thing in Acts, but then over, like I said, in Romans, he says something completely polar opposite. He says, for not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified.
Well, that would be both Jews and Gentiles, though, right? That's
right.
There, but there you're right. He seems to be arguing that it's important to keep the Torah there. Right. And it's true, by the way. Paul's writings are a jumble of contradictions, and we're going to have to struggle with that, right? But I would say personally that you have to really, and this is just my personal feeling, you have to understand Paul through the spectrum of both his writings and the way his writings were understood by those who followed him, and by his opponents, meaning, you read the writings of Paul, and people have made all kinds of assessments that Paul was not against the observing of the Torah, he was against the observing of the Torah, he was pro-Torah, he was anti-Torah. It seems pretty clear to me that Paul came to reject the binding nature of the commandments, whether people would be under liberty to follow the commandments if they wanted to, was up for grabs. But it seems to me that Paul did not believe that the observing of the Torah was a requirement, an absolute requirement for neither Jews nor Gentiles. And I say this for a number of reasons. Number one, it's very clear that the emerging church that came out of his writings did not believe that there was any obligation to observe the commandments. And we know centuries began to persecute the Jewish followers of Jesus who kept on keeping the commandments. So it's very clear that those people who read Paul, meaning the Gentile church that emerged, they did not believe that Paul had any requirement that anyone observe the Torah. It's clear from the behavior of the church and their policy toward those believers in Jesus who did want to keep the Torah. It's also clear from, and we're going to see this in Acts, that that the Jerusalem church was suspicious of him precisely for this issue. We'll see in chapter 21, he's accused right to his face. Look, Paul, we're hearing these ugly rumors about you, that you're teaching people not to keep the Torah. So it's an accusation made against him. It seems to be very clearly the policy of his followers, his Gentile followers. And we know that in the 2nd century, we have the writings about the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, and we know that they considered Paul to be a heretic because he rejected the Torah. So people do try to make the argument that Paul was Torah observant and he didn't reject the observance of the Torah. I think it's a hard case to make, although I understand that the case is made. It's just something that I don't see.
I think we're going to see in verse 19 and 20 of this very chapter, you're going to see more that does make it look like he's Torah observant. And he's teaching that even the Gentiles have to do so as well as you go along. Like I said, once you get to 19 and 20, I'll kind of point out a few little thoughts I have for you.
Okay. We're going to revive the great dispute in Acts 15 now.
One thing I really think I learned about Paul all this time so far, though, is he's very, very much anti-pro anything.
He's anti-pro.
He's anti-pro.
It's interesting that, here you have, we're not really discussing Paul here. This is a speech that Peter's making. And what I've been trying to say is that this speech by Peter sounds like it was written by Paul. And it seems that what's going on in this little piece here between verses 6 and 11 is that Peter is being used in a way that really is typical of the whole book of Acts. People have suggested, and I think there's a lot of merit to this idea, that the agenda of Luke in writing the book of Acts is to try to bridge the gap between Paul and the group in Jerusalem. Because the truth is, and we're going to see this in the letters of Paul, there was, friction. There was a lot of friction between the followers of Jesus based in Jerusalem and Paul based in the diaspora. They did not get along, and they were not on the same page. And that created a problem for Paul because it seemed as if there was no continuity between Jesus and the apostles and Paul. It seemed that Paul was basically starting his own religion and had very little connection to what originally was taking place around Jesus and his followers. And so the agenda of the writer of Acts is to really try to smooth over these differences and create the impression that really they're all one happy family, that they're all on the same team, and Paul and Peter and James, they're basically working together, and they have this little question that comes up here, and they come up with a solution, and now everybody's on the same page. And so some commentaries have pointed out that that's what seems to have happened to Peter here. Peter seems to have basically gone off script in terms of his own beliefs, because these are sentiments that Peter's expressing that are just totally out of character. Peter did not believe that there was no more distinction at this point between Jews and Gentiles. Peter did not believe at this point that salvation is, simply through believing in Jesus and not through observing the Torah. But it seems that this is what he's saying in this speech. And so there were those who suggested that Peter never said this, but the author of Acts is putting these words into Peter's mouth to use him again for the purpose of giving the impression that Peter and Paul are on the same page. As a matter of fact, in church tradition, right, we know this, they try to always portray Peter and Paul as attached at the hip, right? Meaning that they're brothers in faith. You have in Rome, right, the church that has the two statues of Peter and Paul, and I remember in the Lord of the Flies, you had Sam and Eric, the two twins, or the two brothers. They were always said in one breath, Sam and Eric, Sam and Eric. So it's always Peter and Paul, Peter and Paul, Peter and Paul, as if Peter and Paul are the closest colleagues in the world. And that tradition that the church developed was for a purpose, meaning that it would look ugly if Peter was at complete odds with Paul, because it would seem as if Paul is now breaking away and starting his own movement. And so there's this concerted effort to try and make it seem as if Peter and Paul are on the same team. And we know, unfortunately, that's not the case. We know that, and we'll see it in Paul's own writings, that he was a bitter opponent of Peter. They were not on the same page. They did not get along. So it's just a very weird speech here that anyone studying this chapter has to sort of be sensitive to the fact that what Peter is saying here is just totally out of character, and he seems to be giving a speech that Paul could have written. Again, not in the book of Acts. Paul wouldn't say these things in Acts. These kind of sentiments that the law is done away with, and the distinction between Jews and Gentiles done away with, those only come out in Paul's letters. Here again, the whole agenda is to make it seem as if Paul and the Jerusalem council are all one happy family. And then in verse 12, all the people there kept silent and listened to Barnabas and Paul, declaring how many miracles and wonders God had worked through them among the Gentiles. So now they're, able to tell the good news to the council that they've been very successful. And after they had become silent, now meaning the group there, everyone quieted down. Now James answered. So you had again the sort of the troublemakers who were saying, look, these people that Paul is reaching out to, they have to observe all the commandments and they have to get circumcised. And Peter gives this incredibly weird speech, which seems to be saying that there's no more distinction between Jews and Gentiles, and we'll all be saved in the same way, which is through faith in Jesus. James doesn't seem to have any. Maybe didn't even hear this speech by Peter. It seems as if, from James' point of view, this whole speech that Peter allegedly made, he didn't make.
It's like it just went in one ear and out the other, or he didn't catch it all.
Yeah, it's like because if James heard this speech, he would have been upside his head. What kind of speech is that? So it seems as if James at this point is going to speak. And, that's why I get the impression that those sentences that Peter is saying, he didn't say those sentences. And someone just airbrushed them in later on, again, using Peter as this, device, a literary device, to make it sound as if Peter, who is this great apostle, he's the same as Paul. So James here says in verse 13, men and brethren, listen to me, right? Simon has declared how God at the first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it's written. And now, Acts chapter 15 is apparently quoting from the book of Amos, the prophet Amos, chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. Although I will rebuild its ruins, I will set it up. That's how Acts quotes from the book of Amos. The actual verse in Amos I'll read now. It says, on that day I will raise up the fallen booth of David, Sukkot David, I will repair their breaches, and its ruins I will raise up, and I'll build it up as in days of old. So it's
You
it's
can
sort of
certainly
similar.
see the connection, right?
It's similar, but
Right.
not the same.
Right.
And then in verse 17, Acts goes on to say, so that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord who does all these things. So in Amos chapter 9, verse 12, it says, so that they upon whom my name is called shall inherit the remnant of Edom, and all the nations, declares Hashem, who shall do this. So again, it is a very, very tenuous connection between the actual verses in Amos and the way James is allegedly quoting them here in Acts. The point is that what James seems to be saying is that this movement among the Gentiles, to accept the gospel, James seems to be saying that this was prophesied in the prophet Amos. Now, what Amos is actually speaking about is very clearly not taking place here, because Amos is speaking about the complete restoration of the kingdom of David. Some people even understand the booth of David, Sukkot David, to be the rebuilding of the temple that was destroyed. Now, this chapter in the book of Acts, is being written, about 10 to 15 years after the temple's been destroyed, not after the temple's been built.
Right.
And the Jewish sovereignty, this is after the destruction of Jerusalem. The book of Amos is speaking about the restoration of Israel, possibly, including the return of the 10 lost tribes. But, the book of Amos is speaking about, if you look at the verses prior to verses 11 and 12, it speaks about how the nation is going to undergo tremendous tribulation, exile. They're going to be, the people are going to suffer tremendously. So that's the prior prediction in the book of Amos, that the people of Israel are going to really go through horrible times. But then in verses 11 and 12, it's a messianic prophecy. It's speaking about the restoration of the kingdom of Israel, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and that in verse 12, what it seems to be saying is that when the messianic kingdom is here, so the nations of the world will come to recognize the truth about God. And that's the fulfillment we see in Isaiah chapter 60 of the nations coming to Israel's light, and Zechariah chapter 8 verse 23 about 10 people from every nation of the world grabbing the hold of a Jewish person's garment and saying, I want to follow you, we've heard God is with you. And in Zechariah chapter 14 verse 9, in that day God will be one and his name will be one. This is an actual messianic prophecy which clearly didn't happen 2,000 years ago. The fact that you had a small number of Gentiles that became followers of Jesus did not mean that at that time the whole world came to embrace God as the true God. So it's very clear that Amos chapter 9 has certainly not happened yet in history. As a matter of fact, in terms of the dating of the book of Acts, it was the exact opposite. It wasn't the restoration of the kingdom, it was right after the destruction of the kingdom.
Interesting.
So James basically gives that as a preamble to his speech. And then he says in verse 18, this is sort of the punchline, known to God from eternity are all his works. Therefore, I judge. Now, this is very interesting, by the way. What is it happening? How is it happening now that James is giving the ruling? Who is James? We know that James wasn't one of the original 12 apostles.
And was that not the James, the brother of Jesus?
It was, but he wasn't one of the original 12 apostles.
Okay.
Right? He came on the scene later on, allegedly after the resurrection of Jesus. So while Jesus was alive, we know that his brothers were not following him. And so James, it's correct, is the brother of Jesus here. This is the brother of Jesus. And what's strange is that, it's he who is making the ruling, right? He's the one that's making the ruling. And we know from historical sources that it was James that was the leader of the group in Jerusalem until he himself was killed around the year 62. So for about 30 years, it was James who led the Jesus movement, not Peter and not John. And it's probably because, you know, it seems at least that they saw the Jesus line as as a royal line, so to speak. If Jesus was seen as the king, so the next in line would have been his brother James. And so that's the only reason why they would have appointed James the leader, because James certainly, you know, was not a follower of Jesus during Jesus' ministry. So James here rules in verse 19, I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. Now, before we get to this, I apologize, but I wanted to go back and just mention something from earlier, because I forgot to mention this. I think it's important. Back in Peter's speech, where Peter says that neither us or our fathers were able to observe the Torah, you know, it seems impossible to understand. I hope I'm not confusing people by jumping back now, but I just wanted to make sure we nail this down. That when Peter makes this speech, and I don't think he did, but whoever's making the speech, when they say that, you know, why would you want to require the Gentiles to observe the Torah? This is back in verse 10, right? Why would you want to make the Gentiles keep the Torah when neither we or our fathers were able to? That's a very strange thing to say, because it seems to imply that it was impossible to keep the Torah, and there are two problems with that. Number one, God says in Deuteronomy 30 that you can keep the Torah, it's not too difficult. And number two, if it was impossible to keep the Torah, why would God give it and threaten dire punishments if they don't give it, but they don't keep it?
Right.
And it's impossible to understand that. So David Stern, in his commentary, suggests something which I think is just not plausible. He says that, of course, he believes Peter was not rejecting the observance of the Torah. He believes that Peter was Torah observant and that Jews who follow Jesus should be Torah observant. He says that what the criticism here was not against the Torah, but it was against the rabbinic fences that were established by the rabbis to protect the Torah.
The oral law.
And this sort of, you know, these burdens, these heavy burdens of rabbinic fences and extensions of the law. Now, and that's how David Stern understands this, that's the only thing that Peter was criticizing, that's what's too difficult. The problem is that it doesn't really square with the language here, because the language is, you know, the proposal was to make these Gentiles observe the laws of Moses. It doesn't say to observe the you know, fences of the rabbis. So it just, to me, doesn't work out with the language of the passage. If I wanted to be generous, and I wanted to, this is my commentary when I write my commentary to the New Testament, I think what Peter might be meaning is this. Not that it's impossible to keep the commandments. Obviously, it's possible. But what Peter might be saying is this. He might be saying that, look, the Gentiles were never under an obligation to observe the commandments. We know as Jews that it's difficult. It's a yoke. It's not easy to observe the commandments. And when he says that it's a yoke that we can't bear, he doesn't mean that we're not able to keep them. I think that it means that it's difficult to keep them. And we do make mistakes, and we have to obviously repent of those mistakes that we make. I don't think the argument he's making is that it's impossible, as many Christians say, to keep the law. I think what he's saying is, look, we have enough difficulty with it. It's very hard. So if it's hard for us, and it's not so easy for us to keep and for our fathers to have kept, we know how many mistakes we all made, why would we want to impose it on the Gentiles when they're under no real obligation to keep it anyway? So I think that's what it might mean. It may not be a full-blown attack on the ability to observe the Torah.
Okay.
I just wanted to get that in. So back to James. So James says that we're not going to trouble those among the Gentiles, in verse 19 here, who are turning to God. We're not going to require that they get circumcised. and observe all the commandments of the Torah, but, in verse 20, that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood.
Are those Noahide laws, or are those?
That's the $64,000 question.
Because my first thought was that all these things were laws that are actually encoded in the Torah. So not. But then again, I've heard Rabbi Singer say that having impure relationships is a violation of the Noahide laws. Eating the blood from a live animal is a violation of Noahide laws. So it seems like, at first glance, I was thinking that this was all he was saying. Just make sure they follow the Noahide law. I mean, no, I'm sorry. My first glance was it seemed like he was enforcing the Torah by saying this, saying, wherefore the sentence is this: we don't trouble them from among the Gentiles who are turning to God or turning to them. And they're in the process of approaching God, but to start them off with the things that are problematic now, which are these four things, because verse 21 has a connection point that almost brings a different light of context in the whole 3-verse passage, if you want to call it.
You're right. Verse 21 is a huge problem. No one in the world understands it. I think David Stern in his commentary gives 6 or 7 different possibilities of what it means. None of the Christian commentaries understands verse 21. It's simply just not clear what he means.
I think it's part of why the Messianic movement has taken such flight, because if you look at it from the way the Messianics teach it, it makes perfect sense. But you have to see the entire New Testament the way they do for this to make sense. And that is, again, going back to 19 and 20, where he's saying these 4 things, which just so happen to be in the law, where so he's not telling them they'll have to keep the law. They actually do, because 3 of the 4 things he mentioned were dietary laws. But then in verse 21, he says, because Moses in old time having never seen any of them that preach him, being read in the synagogue every Sabbath day, referring to the Gentiles, learning from the law of Moses regularly. So he's saying, don't force them to do all this stuff now. That would be a burden. Just have them do the main things. Stop celebrating Christmas and Easter. Stop eating ham and pig meat. Because those in America, that's our big clutches here. It says, and just let them learn it gradually as they go to the synagogues every Sabbath day, because that's where they teach the law of Moses, and they'll learn this on their own. So it seemed like the burden may have been that learning the entire Torah all at once, or being forced to keep the entire Torah all at once, would have been a burden, a yoke, or an anchor that could have actually drowned them, so to speak.
I never considered that possibility. So what you're saying is that at the beginning of the chapter, there are those people who are saying, look, these guys have to convert, and that would mean that right now they have to observe all the commandments and they have to get circumcised.
Right.
And you're saying that would be too difficult, too much of a burden. So you're saying that James is saying, no, they don't have to do everything now. We're going to sort of slowly break them in by beginning with these particular laws. And that the implication is that they're going to have to, down the road, fully convert to Judaism by getting circumcised and observing all the rest of the laws of the Torah.
Right.
Interesting. I don't see it that way, although,
right.
we can agree to disagree.
Most people don't.
I think that I would go with the understanding, for a number of reasons, that James is not accepting the idea that Gentiles have to ultimately keep all the commandments and get circumcised. And it seems that because you have here a list of commandments. Like, for example, if we were going to say, let's get the Gentiles started, let's choose some. Well, it's I guess it wouldn't be totally unreasonable. These are basically a short version of the 7 Noahide laws, and I think that you could actually find 6 of them out of the 7 here. Let me go through them just to
cool.
Clarify for the listeners and the viewers. First, when he says that we're going to say that they have to abstain from things polluted by idols. So, what it means, very clearly, what it means is that we want them to stay away from anything, because it doesn't speak about food here.
Right, that's
it's
a good
really
point.
more general, that anything that has been touched by idolatry, we want them to keep away from idolatry.
Nice.
Now, that's one of the Noahide laws for sure. And it could be, because we know that another one of the Noahide laws is the prohibition against blasphemy. Now, blasphemy is not mentioned here by James, but it could be that because blasphemy is very similar to idolatry, that he may have sort of included it, although, again, I'm speculating there. So he may not have listed blasphemy at all, or it may be sort of understood because it's so similar to idolatry that that's included. Then he says fornication, which is another one of the 7 Noahide laws. That's the prohibition against, improper sexual relationships. It's referred to in Hebrew as Gilui Arayot. And then he mentions things strangled. Now, that is not clear what it's referring to.
I mean, is that not the oral law on kashrut, or as far as proper slaughtering of an animal? And
yeah, it
right?
could be that it's speaking about something to do with killing an animal properly. It seems that it's a very complicated entry on this list, that if you go to Genesis chapter 9 verses 3 to 5, it speaks about not consuming certain ways of not consuming animals. Let me just bring up the passage here.
I've got it up here also.
So in Genesis 9, what God says to Noah after they after the flood, he says, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you." Previously to this, human beings were not allowed to eat meat. Right? In the Garden of Eden, they were only allowed to eat vegetables and grains and fruits. So now they're given permission to eat everything. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. You're now allowed to eat animals. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. So now for you, animals will be permissible just like the green herbs. But you shall not eat flesh with its life. Meaning that you have to have the animal dead before you eat it. That is its blood. I mean, they have to kill the animal in a way that its blood has all come out. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning from the hand of every beast. I'll require it, and from the hand of every man.
So that seems like it would follow the last prohibition of where he says, "and from blood."
So that's what I want to get to. I think that when it says "from that which is strangled," I'm just making a speculation here, that an animal that didn't have all its blood drained and was not fully dead was prohibited from being eaten, meaning that if you just sort of strangled the animal without killing it fully and you ate it, I think it's saying that you can't eat that which is merely strangled. You have to actually have it killed by draining out all its blood, as it says in Genesis chapter 9, verses 3 to 4. And then right after this, because it's a dietary law. In Genesis 9, it's a dietary law, but then it mentions not killing people, right? In verse 5 and in 6, etc., right? Surely for your lifeblood I'll demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I'll require it, and from the hand of every man, from the hand of every man's brother I'll require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Meaning that it's going from a dietary law to the laws of murder in verses 5 and 6. And so I would propose, again, I'm far from being able to prove this, that when it lists here as one of the prohibitions from that which is strangled, I would say that corresponds to the Noahide law of eating the limb of a living creature, And then when the next one says from blood, it's speaking about murder. Just as in the chapter 9 of Genesis, it lists the dietary law followed by the prohibition against murder. And he doesn't list in here the prohibition of theft, of stealing. That's one of the Noahide laws. But it could be, again, that in the same way that James is sort of wrapping up blasphemy into idolatry, he could be including in the prohibition against murder also the prohibition against robbery. I mean, that it could be sort of short forms saying killing and robbing. The only one that wouldn't be here on this list at all, any way, shape, form whatsoever, is the positive Noahide law of setting up courts of law. And that wouldn't be long, because here James is speaking about what you tell an individual Gentile who's coming to embrace the God of Israel and the belief in Jesus as the Messiah. So this is a law, the positive law of setting up courts of law is not imposed upon an individual, that's imposed upon a Gentile community. It's not an individual law, it's a communal law. So if you take out that number 7 from the Noahide laws, it seems that the list here that James is giving is either 3 or 4 out of the remaining 6 Noahide laws, or possibly contains really some allusion to all 6 Noahide laws. And it seems that because of that, and just because of the general Jewish idea that in Judaism historically, we don't believe that Gentiles ever had to observe the Torah. There'd be no reason for James to be advocating that here. And what he seems to be saying is, as opposed to you people who are coming in the beginning of the chapter saying that the Gentiles have to keep the whole Torah and have to get circumcised, James seems to be stepping back and saying, no, it's not necessary. All they need to do is, if they want to become followers of Jesus, if they're Gentiles, is to observe the Noahide laws. And in verse 21, I have no idea what James is saying. He may be, in verse 21, saying that, look, that's what the Gentiles will do. And in verse 21, he says, and for us Jews, Moses has been throughout many generations read, we read him every week in the synagogue, every Shabbat, and he's preached, and he's basically, it seems to be a way of saying that, they will go their way by following the Noahide laws, and we, the Jewish community, the Jewish believers in Jesus, we have Moses, and that's been our tradition throughout, history, is that we are connected to the Torah that's read in the synagogue every Shabbat. It's sort of possibly maybe what it means. Or, a more creative way of looking at it is that he may be saying that, why is it? You have to sort of listen deeply here. He may be saying in verse 21, why is it now that we have this influx of Gentiles into our movement? So what James may be saying is that, it is this continuation of the practice of Judaism by those people who were Torah observant that is leading these Gentiles to want to join the Jesus movement, because we know that so many of the people that Paul was able to reach were the God-fearers who, were coming into the synagogues and listening to the Torah being read. So, again, I did quite a bit of research into this verse 21. It's a bit of a quagmire. No one really seems to understand what James is saying here. It's quite loose and it's quite vague in terms of what he means. But I would just say, in terms of how I read Acts 15, what James is really advocating here is that they don't require a full conversion of Gentiles to Torah Judaism by getting circumcised. He doesn't even mention circumcision here. He says all they need to do, right? We're not going to impose that upon them. They just need to simply follow the Noahide laws. And I think what's important to, again, just be aware of is that the apostles, being led here by James, and again, totally against whatever speech that Peter allegedly made, the apostles seem to want to maintain the distinction between Jews and Gentiles. He doesn't seem to accept what Peter had said. He doesn't seem to accept this idea that we're all going to be homogenized into one group. It's only later, and Paul, by the way, himself, that's what makes it so difficult to imagine that Peter said it. Paul himself doesn't express these ideas in this chapter. Paul doesn't speak about one new man and the middle wall of partition being broken down and they're all one in the body of Jesus. He doesn't come out and say that he believes that now there's no distinction between Jews and Gentiles. Paul is playing his cards close to his vest. And Paul here doesn't say that he believes that Jews no longer have to observe the Torah. For some strange reason, again, that's why I'm positive that those few verses that Peter allegedly says, he didn't say, because it's just so out of character, and in the next verses, James doesn't seem to have even heard it.
Right, he has no response to it hardly at all.
He would have jumped all over his head. What in the world are you talking about? What have you been smoking? So it seems that in this chapter, the apostles, they are traditionally Jewish in their perspective, and they do maintain this distinction between Jews and Gentiles. And basically, Jews have a path to God through observing the 613 commandments, and Gentiles, their path involves observing the 7 commandments, the 7 Noahide laws. We know that in Paul's writings, which he hasn't expressed here, and again, because the writer of Acts is not interested in sharing the true picture of Paul. The writer of Acts is interested in sanitizing Paul. So you don't have the sentiments that Paul is going to express in his letters about the breakdown of distinctions between Jews and Gentiles, and the idea that both Jews and Gentiles only need to believe in Jesus. Their salvation is through faith, and the Gentiles become grafted into the Jewish people through faith. So really, there are a few things that are going on here in Acts, but a few things that are going on behind the scenes which will not become fully clear until we get to the letters of Paul. Okay. So basically verse 22 is a recapitulation of what's happened so far. It's the Jerusalem decree. It pleased the apostles and elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas, who was also named Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brethren, and they wrote this letter by them, which is the following. It's a recapitulation. In verse 23, the apostles, the elders, and the brethren, to the brethren who are of the Gentiles in Antioch, Syria, Cilicia, greetings. Since we have heard that some who went out from us have troubled you with words, unsettling your souls, saying, you must be circumcised and keep the Torah, to whom we gave no such commandment. So again, this to me is an indication that James was not in favor of having the Gentiles keep all the commandments. He's distinguishing here between those people who wanted you to keep all the commandments and us. We're not unsettling you with that sentiment. We're not saying that you must be circumcised and keep the law. So we didn't give any such commandment, James says. It seemed good to us, James says, being assembled with one accord. Now that's a bit of a stretch. They weren't of one accord. This is a lot of rancor was over this discussion. So we wanted to send with one accord to send chosen men to you, our beloved Barnabas and Paul. And again, this is so much part of the agenda of Acts, is to make it seem as if, everybody's cozy, that Paul and the apostles, they're very lovey-dovey, they're very cozy. And again, it's trying to show the continuity between Paul and the group in Jerusalem, which would go back to Jesus. So it's really a way of connecting Jesus to Paul through the Jerusalem group led by James, the brother of Jesus. And if you can make everyone nice and lovey-dovey and one happy family, Paul now seems to be in line with Jesus and his movement. And again, the truth is that from the letters of Paul, we're going to see that the relationship was very rocky. So when they say here, our beloved Barnabas and Paul, that's a little bit of editorializing by Luke. So James is saying that we sent them, men who have risked their lives for the name of our Lord. We've therefore sent Judas and Silas, who will also report the same things by word of mouth. For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things. Meaning that the only thing that you guys have to do, he doesn't hint here that this is just the starting point. You're going to have to do more down the road. It seems that this is the definitive ruling that for Gentiles, all you have to do are these necessary things, that you abstain from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, from sexual immorality, and if you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. Farewell. And again, part of the reason why there may not be a neat and clean correspondence between this list and the 7 Noahide laws is because even within rabbinic writings, it wasn't so clear exactly what the 7 laws were, how they were defined, and here there's a little bit also, it is not an exact correspondence, but I think that the gist of what James seems to be saying here is that he's presenting essentially the Noahide laws either explicitly or I would say they're sort of wrapped up in this list. And I think at this point, Paul thinks that he's got it made in the shade, because he's now being sent back, with the approval of James. It seems as if now James is patting Paul on the back and saying, look, Paul, you have your marching orders, we've told you what you need to do. All you need to do is to impose the 7 Noahide laws on the Gentiles, and sort of the assumption is that for Jews, though, right, like you, Paul, and other Jews in the diaspora, you obviously have to keep all the 613 commandments. And Paul, I believe, at this point, inside is sort of smiling, and he's saying, yeah, right, when I'm gone and I'm in the diaspora and you're not going to be there, breathing down my neck, I'm going to do what I want to do, which is, again, to teach the idea that it's only faith that saves you, not your works, and the commandments are no longer binding, and there's no distinction between Jews and Gentiles. I think Paul feels that he now has the license and the ability to pursue his own ideas, and sort of he feels that the Jerusalem group is sort of giving him that license now, because they are sending him off, he feels that they're sort of making him in charge. Gotcha. I think, that's really all I wanted to share on this chapter.
Well, good, because we just got a phone call, and as long as it's on topic, we'll we'll take the call. Welcome to the show. Thanks for calling in. Tell us your name, where you're calling from. Hello, are you still there? Caller, can you hear us? Maybe they realize the show is over.
Tommy, can you hear me?
Yeah. There you go. Can you hear me now? The Verizon guy has never been out to my house. Those people who know what Verizon is will know exactly what I'm talking about. Well, Rabbi, it has been just fascinating and just wonderful. I just got to say, I learned a lot tonight. I actually really did, because, for me up until tonight, this whole chapter was a grand slam messianic thing altogether that really just was one of the major messianic chapters that locked in their movement. But as we kind of worked our way through it, there's definitely holes through that. There's definitely holes in that altogether.
Well, I've seen many messianic commentaries that accept the idea that, James was suggesting that the Gentiles observe the Noahide laws.
Right. Wow.
So it's not really such a radical idea. Again, I'm willing to accept the idea that this chapter is far from clear. There's so many holes in it. I mean, Peter's speech is a real problem. What exactly does James mean? Mm-hmm. Because, again, it would have been much neater and cleaner if he actually spelled out the 7 Noahide laws rather than sort of getting a few of them and hinting at a few of them. So it's not as neat and clean as it could have been, but it seems to me, at least from the the back and forth of what's happening, and especially the way James frames his ruling, that that he really simply felt, because it's what Judaism teaches, right? It's Judaism teaches that non-Jews do not have to observe the laws of the Torah.
Right. It's very clear.
They can have a relationship with God and have a share in the world to come simply by following the Noahide laws. And so James was ruling in the way a traditional Jew would rule, and says, look, these Gentiles coming into the movement, if they just keep what they're supposed to keep, the Noahide laws, they don't need to feel that it's important to fully embrace the Torah, get circumcised, and convert fully. It's just not necessary. So I really get the impression that's what's going on. And I think the important thing for us as we go through the rest of the books of the New Testament are going to be to see, number one, how in the book of Acts, this is far from a done deal, meaning that it looks like, with this chapter, it's all peaceful now and everyone's, on the same page, and everyone's happy that, Paul and Barnabas were schlepped back to Jerusalem to iron this out. And it seems at the end of this chapter that, okay, everything's cool. We're going to see very soon that, no, everything is not cool. He's going to still be under a lot of heat, and he's going to come under a lot of fire. And, and that's in a book that was written to make it seem as if everything was nice and hunky-dory. So even with an agenda to have in the book of Acts, painting this one big happy family where Paul and James and Peter and John, they're all on the same page, they're all, on the same team, despite that agenda, you still will see that there's tension between Paul and the group in Jerusalem. And then, again, when we get to the letters of Paul, we're going to see from the horse's mouth what he really is about, and how you'll see that it's very obvious why there would be great tension between him and the group in Jerusalem, because he's going to basically put his cards on the table, and we're going to see that he would be a problem. He would be a problem.
It's kind of like Donald Trump and Paul Ryan right now.
I don't want to go there. Canadians are not allowed to make comments about American politics.
That's probably safe that way. All right, thank you, Rabbi. I had a great time. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Check out Rabbi Skovac and all of his work. You can search for him, JewsForJudaism.ca on YouTube. Rabbi Michael Skovac, if you just Google that name, you'll find his stuff everywhere. Rabbi, shalom, shalom to you, and to everybody, Lihitrot, Shavua Tov, shalom, shalom.
Shavua Tov.
אתם תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה